All right, today should be a quick one. I'm going to start trying to make some videos on individual functions. And so today this is going to be about the grepl function, which we're introduced to in lab one, but it's something that you can use throughout the semester. So I just want to give you the real basic of what grepl is, right? So at its very basic, grepl is something to say, hey, I want to search a variable for a particular character string, right? So for example, I've got this lone data set that we've used before. And let's look at a variable. It's usually used for characters. So I have home ownership, right? And home ownership is set with rent, mortgage, mortgage. I think ownership is in there as well too. And so I could definitely, in this case, probably turn it into a categorical variable. But for the purpose of explaining grep, let's use that. So we're going to go in here, and I'm going to say grepl, and then open parenthesis, and then the first quote, that is the string I'm going to look for. So I could look for rent, I could look for ren, I could look for re, but it's going to be exact, right? So if I look for capital rent, it's not going to find it because rent in there was lowercase. So I'm going to say lowercase rent, fine. So it's going to look for every row that rent is in, but I have to tell it what variable to look for. So I'm going to say look in the loans, and then in the column, what was that? That was home ownership, right? So what that is going to do is grepl is going to look in the column of home ownership under the data set loans, and it is going to find every row in which home ownership has the word rent in it, right? So if I run that, it's going to, it returns a true false statement, right? So each one of those, this first one is saying that in the first row, rent is in there, true, right? So if I look in here, sure enough, in the very first row, rent is in here. It's in the second, but not the third, right? So when I go in here, true, true, false, right? So it's returning this vector of trues and falses, right? So that's what grepl, when you ask grepl, it gives you true, false. Now, there are some things you can do with this that are actually handy, because in R considers a true as a 1 and a false as a 0. So if I wanted to know how many times rent came up, I can leverage that. So I'm going to go ahead and say, instead of just running this, I'm going to put it into a variable. So I'm going to name a variable named rent, and I'm going to say rent gets that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say, and run this. And so now, rather than outputting it, it has put it over here into a variable. So now rent is a variable that's just a list of trues and falses. Now, if I say now over here on my code, I can now say sum rent, right? And when I do that, it gives me 21, because it is treating every false as a 0 and every true as a 1. So when I say sum that list of trues and falses, it gives me the number of trues. So that 21 means there are 21 rows, each row here is a lone, in which the word rent, all lowercase, shows up in the home ownership variable, which is handy in and of itself. That's a lot of times what you're going to use. Another thing that you can use that is kind of useful on grepl is, what if I want to get a list of all of the observations where rent shows up? Well, if you remember correctly, if you watched our video on how to reference things in a data set, you remember that my data set is loans. When I put in brackets, I can access things like, if I say 3 comma, that gives me the third row, right? Here is my third row right here. But it turns out, if I say, instead of 3, I say the variable rent there, it's going to say, I'm only going to give me the rows where it has a true in it, which in this case is where my rent is, right? So if I run that now I get a subset of all of the rows where that grepl statement returned true. So it's going to give me every observation where the word rent was in home ownership. If I wanted to, I could go as far as to say, I'm going to call this loans.rent equals, and now, as you can see up here on the right, I now have a new data set, which is a subset of just the loans where the word rent was in home ownership. So this is just a couple of the ways, this is how grepl works in a couple of the ways why it's simple but powerful to help you look for character strings, because that's really what this is for character strings, to find a word or a subset in there. If you're just doing numbers or you're trying to do categorical, not what we want grepl for, but this is what the power of it is. So I hope that was helpful. If you got any questions, send me a direct message as always. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video.